Imagine this. A god creates galaxies, black holes, time itself, and then he writes 10 rules for humanity. Not 1,000, not a book, 10, so you'd expect the greatest moral code ever written. But when you actually read it, slowly, like a real document, something feels off. Because the first rules aren't about protecting children. They're not about ending slavery. They're not about stopping rape. They're about him, worship me, don't make images, don't say my name wrong, take a day off or else. And here's the question that should make your stomach tighten. If these were the foundation of morality, why do they miss the crimes that destroy human lives? Stay with me, because once you see what's missing, you can't unsee what this list really is: the moral code that starts with ego. Most people assume the 10 Commandments begin with obvious moral guardrails. Don't kill, don't steal, don't hurt others. That's how they're usually remembered, and that memory feels comforting. It suggests the list was designed to protect people from each other. But that's not how it actually starts. The opening lines aren't about human suffering at all. They are about loyalty, about attention, about priority. No other gods before me, no images. Don't misuse my name, keep my day holy. Before a single word is spent on violence, exploitation, or harm, 4 full commandments are spent establishing devotion. Now pause on that. You are supposedly handed 10 rules to guide all of humanity across all time. 10 chances to define right and wrong. And nearly half of them are used to say, look at me, focus on me, arrange your life around me. That does not feel like moral clarity. It feels like a demand. This is the part many people never sit with long enough. A truly moral system usually begins with how we treat each other, especially the weak. It starts with harm reduction, with empathy, with boundaries that protect life. But this one starts with authority securing its position. It opens by making allegiance the highest virtue. That matters because beginnings shape everything that follows. When the foundation of morality is submission, the habit you learn first is obedience. Not understanding, not questioning, just compliance. You are trained to ask who commands this, not whether it causes harm. And once obedience is framed as sacred, the moral compass quietly shifts. Actions are no longer judged by their consequences, but by whether they align with authority. Pain can be excused. Violence can be reframed. Cruelty can be justified if it serves the higher command. This is how systems gain power over minds before they ever control bodies. By teaching that loyalty comes before conscience, by placing reverence above compassion. When that structure is locked in, almost anything can follow. And historically, it did. This is not a small oversight or a technical detail. It is the psychological core of the list. A moral code that begins by centering itself does not exist to liberate people. It exists to organize them. And once you see that starting point clearly, the rest of the commandments stop looking like timeless wisdom and start looking like something else entirely. The statue problem. One of the most revealing commandments is the ban on graven images. Do not make them. Do not bow to them. At first glance, it sounds harmless, even sensible. A warning against superstition. A reminder not to confuse objects with meaning. But the moment you slow down and actually weigh it morally, something feels wrong. So let's run a simple test. Is carving a statue worse than beating a child? Is shaping stone more dangerous than starving a family? Is creating an image more immoral than owning another human being? According to the list, yes, because the commandment against images makes the top 10, while protection of the vulnerable does not. That should stop you. A moral system reveals its priorities by what it chooses to forbid. And here, the priority is not suffering. It is symbolism. The rule is not concerned with what you do to people, but with what you do with objects. It treats rituals as moral landmines, while real harm barely registers. This is the difference between ethics and control. Ethics asks who gets hurt. Control asks who stays loyal. When a system teaches that symbols are dangerous, it trains fear in a very specific direction. The problem is no longer cruelty or injustice. The problem becomes deviation. Incorrect worship, wrong gestures, forbidden representations. Morality collapses into compliance. History shows exactly where this mindset leads. People did not simply avoid idols, they destroyed art they considered impure. They smashed statues they associated with rival beliefs. They erased entire cultures in the name of spiritual purity. Beauty became suspect, creativity became dangerous, expression became a threat. Because once you believe an object can offend the divine, destroying it feels righteous. And once destruction feels righteous, violence no longer needs empathy to justify itself. This is how intolerance is born, not from hatred at first, but from fear. Fear that the wrong symbol will corrupt the community. Fear that someone else's way of seeing the world is dangerous. And when your mind is trained to fear a statue, the transition is subtle. Soon it is not just the image that feels wrong, it is the person who made it, the person who reveres it, the person who thinks differently. At that point, morality has fully slipped its leash. What remains is not concern for human well-being, but enforcement. And that brings us directly to the next commandment, where control stops being symbolic and starts becoming absolute. A day off, or death. Remember the Sabbath day. On the surface, it sounds gentle, almost humane. Rest is good. Recovery matters. Even modern psychology agrees that humans need pauses, rhythms, limits. So most people hear this commandment and assume it was an early form of worker protection. But that is not what it was. The original idea was not take care of yourself. It was, this day belongs to God. The time itself was sacred, not because rest heals the body, but because obedience reinforces authority. The commandment was not about human limits. It was about divine ownership of time. And the consequences make that unmistakably clear. In the original context, breaking the Sabbath was not a minor error. It was not a warning. It was not a fine. It was death. A man was executed for gathering sticks, not for violence, not for cruelty, for collecting wood on the wrong day. Sit with that image for a moment. Imagine a society where someone capable of real harm might walk free, while a tired worker is killed for trying to stay warm. That is not moral prioritization. That is ritual enforcement elevated above human life. This is where the true function of the rule becomes visible. When you can force an entire population to stop and start on command, you are not just organizing schedules, you are synchronizing identity. You are training people to experience time itself as permission-based. When everyone rests on the same day for the same reason, belonging becomes conditional. To exist inside the community, you must obey the rhythm, deviate, and you are no longer just different. You are guilty. This is how power embeds itself into daily life, not only through beliefs, but through habits, through calendars, through routines. Once authority controls your time, it no longer needs to shout. Your life already bends around it. And that is why this commandment mattered so much. It was never about compassion, it was about visibility, a way to instantly identify who was compliant and who was not, who belonged and who did not. Once a system can claim your time, it does not need chains. It already has access to your attention, your fear, and eventually, your thoughts, which is why the next commandment does not aim at behavior at all. It aims somewhere far more intimate. It aims at the family. Honor your father and mother, even if they hurt you. This line is almost always presented as gentle wisdom. Respect your parents, be grateful, know where you came from. On the surface, it sounds reasonable, even comforting. Families matter. Care matters. But the problem appears the moment this idea becomes an absolute law instead of a moral guideline. Because not every parent is honorable. Some parents are abusive, some are manipulative, some are emotionally absent while demanding loyalty, some use guilt as a leash and love as a bargaining chip. And many children grow up learning that silence is safer than honesty. So what happens when a moral system says honor them no matter what? It creates a one-way hierarchy. Authority flows downward, obedience flows upward. The child is always wrong by default, because questioning itself becomes a violation. Respect is demanded, not earned. Harm is excused in the name of structure. If you grew up in a healthy home, this commandment may sound benign, but if you grew up in a home where love was conditional, it lands very differently. It does not feel like guidance. It feels like permission. Permission for power to remain unchallenged. Permission for harm to hide behind tradition. A truly moral framework would begin with protection. It would say safeguard children, stop abuse, break cycles that damage the next generation. Care flows downward toward the vulnerable, not upward toward authority. Responsibility comes with power, not submission. But this commandment flips that logic. It centers duty over safety, order over well-being. It reinforces the ancient idea that stability matters more than justice, even if that stability is built on silence. And once authority is sanctified in the family, the pattern scales effortlessly. Parents become priests, priests become kings, kings become governments. The lesson is already internalized. Authority must be honored, even when it harms you. That is why rebellion becomes framed as moral failure instead of moral courage. Questioning becomes disobedience. Resistance becomes sin. This is why people often say, the commandments built civilization. In a sense, they did, but not by nurturing compassion. They did it by training compliance. By teaching generations that hierarchy is sacred and that suffering should be endured quietly for the sake of order. And here is the contradiction that cracks the foundation. Even the commandments that appear moral at first glance rely on context, power, and position. They are not universal truths. They are rules designed for a specific structure, at a specific time, to preserve a specific kind of authority. And once you notice that, the rest of the list begins to look very different. Don't murder, except when we say it's holy. Now we reach the line almost everyone points to as proof that the 10 Commandments are moral at their core. You shall not murder. Finally, something clear. Finally, a rule that seems universal. Killing people is wrong. Most of us agree on that instinctively. But the moment you step back and read the wider story, the clarity dissolves. Because the same God who declares "do not murder" also commands wars. He orders cities to be wiped out. Men, women, children, entire populations erased. Suddenly, murder is not defined by the act itself, but by who authorizes it. So this commandment does not mean life is sacred. It means something far narrower. Do not kill the wrong people. Do not kill without permission. Do not kill members of your own group outside the approved rules. Once you understand that, the moral framing changes completely. Outsiders are no longer protected by the rule. Enemies are exempt. Those labeled unclean, heretical, or threatening fall outside the circle of moral concern. The commandment bends without breaking, because authority decides when it applies. This is the central danger of morality rooted in command rather than consequence. Authority can always redraw the line. It can always say this does not count. This killing is justified. This violence is necessary. This suffering serves a higher purpose. And when people believe violence can be holy, language shifts. Killing stops being murder. It becomes duty, obedience, sacrifice. Once words change, emotions follow. Guilt fades. Responsibility dissolves. The act feels clean because it has been renamed. History is full of examples of this pattern. When authority declares violence righteous, ordinary people carry it out while believing themselves moral. They are not acting out of cruelty. They are acting out of loyalty. That is what makes it so dangerous. A truly moral rule would draw a hard line around life itself. It would say harm is wrong regardless of who commands it. It would not bend based on tribe, belief, or banner. But this commandment does not do that. It leaves the door open, as long as the right voice gives the order. Once a system can redefine killing, it can redefine anything. Justice becomes flexible, compassion becomes conditional, and morality becomes a tool rather than a principle. That is why this commandment, despite sounding virtuous, rests on unstable ground. It does not protect humanity, it protects authority. And when authority decides who deserves to live, the next step is inevitable. Because if people can be killed by permission, they can also be owned. Adultery, not about love, about property. Do not commit adultery. Most people hear that line and immediately translate it into modern language. Loyalty, trust, faithfulness, emotional betrayal. We imagine broken hearts and damaged relationships. We read today's values back into an ancient rule. But that is not what this commandment was built on. In its original context, adultery was not primarily about love, it was about ownership. Women were not seen as autonomous individuals with equal agency. They were viewed as property belonging first to a father, then to a husband. Adultery was a crime because it violated a man's exclusive claim over what was considered his. That is why the rule was enforced asymmetrically. Men in these stories could have multiple wives. They could keep concubines. Kings were praised while maintaining entire harems. Yet a woman was allowed only one partner. Her body was regulated because it was tied to lineage, inheritance, and male certainty. If this commandment were truly about the sanctity of marriage, it would apply equally. It would condemn polygamy. It would protect mutual trust on both sides. But it does not. Because its foundation is not equality, it is power. Once you see that imbalance clearly, the moral language starts to dissolve. The rule is not about emotional harm or broken promises between equals. It is about protecting male ownership and ensuring that bloodlines remain uncontested. Love is incidental. Control is central. And this pattern repeats. The commandments do not speak the language of consent, dignity, or personal autonomy. They speak the language of hierarchy. Who belongs to whom? Who inherits what? Who has authority and who must submit? This is not accidental. It reflects a world where morality was designed to stabilize a social structure, not to maximize well-being. The goal was order, not fairness. Continuity, not compassion. Once you understand that, a deeper realization sets in. The list is not concerned with inner experience or emotional truth. It does not ask whether harm was done. It asks whether rules were violated, whether boundaries of ownership were crossed. And that prepares the ground for the final commandment, the most revealing one of all, because it does not stop at actions. It goes further. It reaches into the mind itself. It does not say, do not take. It says, do not want. And that is where control becomes complete. The thought crime. You shall not covet. Not don't steal, not don't harm, not don't take what belongs to someone else. Simply, do not want, do not desire, do not feel. This is not a rule about behavior. It is a rule about the inner world. And the moment a moral system steps inside your mind, it crosses a dangerous line. Actions can be controlled. Choices can be debated. But thoughts arise on their own. Desire is not a decision. It is a reflex of being human. You see something better, safer, more beautiful, and your brain responds. That impulse is not evil. It is how ambition, learning, and progress begin. So when desire itself is labeled sinful, something profound happens. Everyone becomes guilty by default, not for what they did, but for what they felt. And you cannot escape it, because you cannot turn your mind off. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the mechanism. Guilt is incredibly useful. Guilty people are easier to guide, easier to correct, easier to keep dependent. When you believe your own thoughts condemn you, you start looking outside yourself for cleansing, for permission, for forgiveness. A system that controls actions controls bodies. A system that controls thoughts controls identity. And then there is the detail that exposes exactly how ancient this mindset is. The list of things you are forbidden to desire: house, wife, servant, ox, donkey. The wife is placed right in the middle of property, not as a person with agency, but as an asset alongside animals and labor. And the word servant in this context often refers to a slave. The commandment does not say, do not own slaves. It says, do not desire your neighbor's slave. Ownership itself is treated as normal. Moral concern never touches it. This reveals the deeper truth of the list. It is not structured around human dignity. It is structured around ownership, hierarchy, and control. It does not ask whether a system is just. It assumes the system is fixed and regulates desire, so it does not threaten that order. And that brings us to the most devastating realization of all. The greatest moral failure of the Ten Commandments is not found in their wording. It is found in what they never bother to say. What's missing is the real confession. If this list truly came from a perfect moral mind, the omissions should disturb you more than anything written on the stone, because morality is defined as much by what it forbids as by what it ignores. So ask the simplest question. Where is the commandment that says do not own human beings? Slavery was not rare. It was not an edge case. It was woven into daily life. A single sentence could have ended generations of suffering. One clear line could have changed the course of history, but the list says nothing. Ownership of people is treated as normal, unquestioned, invisible. Then ask another question: where is do not rape? Sexual violence is one of the most severe violations of autonomy and dignity. It shatters lives. Yet the commandments never name it as a moral absolute. In the surrounding laws, rape is often treated as a property offense against a male guardian, not as a crime against the person harmed. That silence is not accidental. It reflects priorities. And what about children? Where is do not abuse them? Where is protect them? Where is do not break the vulnerable simply because you can? There is no commandment against torture. No commandment against dehumanization. No commandment demanding equality. No insistence that all people matter simply because they are people. These are not modern obsessions. These are core, moral insights. They are the principles we now consider foundational to any just society, and we did not receive them carved into stone. We arrived at them slowly, painfully, through empathy, reflection, and resistance to authority. That leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. This list does not sound like the voice of the universe speaking timeless truth. It sounds like the concerns of a small ancient community trying to survive. A community focused on cohesion, loyalty, inheritance, and control. A group trying to stabilize power by sanctifying it. Once you see that, you understand why the commandments are defended so fiercely. Because admitting they are flawed does not just challenge a text, it challenges the idea that morality must come from above. If the list is human, then responsibility shifts. There is no divine shield to hide behind, no eternal authority to outsource judgment to. Morality becomes something we must own. And that is the real confession, hidden in what the commandments fail to say. Ethics did not descend from the sky. They emerged from human experience, from suffering recognized, from empathy expanded, from the courage to say we can do better. And we did. Here's what hits hardest. The 10 Commandments are treated like the foundation of goodness, but they don't actually teach the best parts of being human. They don't teach consent, they don't teach equality, they don't protect the most vulnerable, they don't confront the worst crimes. Instead, they start with worship, escalate into control, and end with thought policing. And that tells us something psychological. When people are afraid of chaos, they cling to certainty. When life feels fragile, they want rules carved in stone. But a list isn't moral just because it's old, and authority isn't truth just because it's loud. Real morality is quieter than religion. It doesn't need thunder, it doesn't need tablets, it doesn't need fear. It begins with a simple ability: to imagine someone else's pain and decide not to cause it. That's empathy, that's reason, that's progress. So the next time someone says, "Without the 10 Commandments, society collapses," ask them, why isn't slavery forbidden? Why isn't rape forbidden? Why does God care more about statues than suffering? And if this video challenged something you were taught, don't run from that discomfort. That discomfort is your mind waking up. Subscribe if you value truth over tradition, and as always, keep questioning.